I would love to introduce our very first speaker, Danny Valdes, who is the co-chair of DSA's Cuba Solidarity Working Group, a Cuban American organizer. Danny has worked to end the U.S. blockade and all sanctions that punish working people, building solidarity across the borders. Danny, I do want to lead with this question for you. You've been on the front lines of organizing around Cuba. As the co-chair of the DSA Cuba Solidarity Working Group, can you talk a little bit about what the reality looks like for Cuban communities under U.S. sanctions and how organizers here can stand in solidarity?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. As was said, my name is Danny Valdez. I'm the co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America Cuban Solidarity Working Group. It's a mouthful. There's actually more, like International Committee and all this other stuff, but we'll leave that out. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And to answer your question to at the forefront, in the 90s, the USSR collapsed, and that led to a very difficult economic situation in Cuba, and it's a time that they call the special period there. It's a time when a lot of the conditions that you were speaking about were present in Cuba, and it took them a long time to even get to a tolerable place. I would say the situation in Cuba right now is worse than that time. Um, there's just a palpable sense of desperation on the island right now. People are scrounging for literally everything. We're talking even down to like toilet paper is difficult to get. Um, and shortages of all kinds of fuel, of equipment, of just basic needs. I'm sure you've all seen in the news recently they can't even keep the power grid in Cuba in a stable enough place to have consistent electricity. They haven't had a full 24-hour day of electricity in over a year. And some of these are planned brownouts, and some of them are just, the entire island's grid goes down. And I grew up in Miami. I'm a Cuban American. I have Cuban American parents in Miami, and all that you think that means I grew up with is what I grew up with. And what I heard growing up was this was a product of a corrupt government, that this was a product of communism, that this was a product of many other factors. But I don't think I ever heard mentioned the outsized role that the U.S. blockade plays in Cuba, and it's just not really discussed. In fact, my grandmother thinks the blockade is mostly just Cuban propaganda to make excuses for their shortcomings. So it's a very sensitive topic still today in the Miami Cuban community, but there is, I think, some recognition starting because we have newer Cubans who are coming all the time, and they've only grown up under the sanctions regime, and they understand. They have more of an understanding of what role U.S. sanctions have played in contributing to the state of Cuba right now. So when we talk about the blockade, it's an interesting, morbidly interesting regime, because most of the time when we're dealing with sanctions, even though they have effects beyond their target, most of the time sanctions are targeted against an institution or an individual or a bank, or in Cuba, the reason we call it a blockade is because it is indeed sanctions against an entire country, just blanket sanctions. There's no wiggle room there. There's no targeting. There's not even they're not even pretending that these are targeted sanctions. It's the most explicit regime change focused program of sanctions that I think that the U.S. has. That's been the stated goal from the beginning. It began as an executive order in 1962 from JFK. And since then, it has evolved into this complex web of executive orders, State Department policy, and actual U.S. law. So there are congressional laws on the books, like the Helms-Burton Act, that were passed during the Clinton administration, that codified the certain elements of the blockade and subsequently makes it much more difficult to repeal and much more difficult to navigate around, because now we're talking about overturning law in Congress in order to make real progress on what the blockade does and how it affects Cubans every day. So it is this complicated web of things. There are some more modern tactics that have been used. Do you have any other questions, or should I just keep on
Go ahead.
going? Or
Yeah.
okay, great.
Yeah.
So one thing that's important and is a more modern development of sort of how the blockade has evolved is this list that the U.S. State Department maintains called the State Sponsors of Terrorism list. There are 4 countries on this list. I think they are North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Cuba. These are the 4 countries that are on this list. And this is a list that once you are on it, you become the target of not just direct sanctions to your country, but what the basic effect is, it internationalizes the blockade, because now third parties, even that are not the United States or Cuba, risk getting sanctioned by doing business with what the U.S. calls a state sponsor of terror. And there are many examples of Swiss companies, of even at the height of COVID, there was I think it was a Swiss company that tried to sell air ventilators to Cuba, and that transaction was not allowed to happen, because most of the money that moves in the world moves through the United States. There's a global banking system called SWIFT that processes every digital financial transaction in the world, basically. There are alternatives being built up right now as a result of this sort of like U.S. imperial regime that has been going on. But the State Department will flag a transaction, and that company or that country will be sanctioned, often to the point of collapse in terms of companies. So it's a very serious risk to do business with Cuba. Some countries like China are powerful enough to sort of like take on the risk, but many just aren't willing to, and that's sort of understandable. And what it does is it financially and economically isolates Cuba from the rest of the world, to the extent it goes so deep that Cuban diplomats who work in other countries often cannot open bank accounts in foreign countries. And so the Cuban government literally mails them cash in order to pay them. And this is true of the Cuban economy. They don't have credit. They don't have access to international credit markets. And so nearly everything that Cuba imports, and it is an import economy. People debate about whether that was a mistake in the 90s to transition to importing so many things. That can be discussed. But they do import a lot of the stuff that they need, which is part of the reason they're in the situation that they're in right now. Everything has to be paid for in cash. In fact, if you go to Havana and you look out onto the bay, you will see cargo ships just docked out there, just waiting for, cash. And these are like necessary items, right? These are like basic staples that are just sitting there being withheld from people, because the Cuban government has to choose every day. Are we going to feed people, or are we going to pay to import things, right? No other country in the world runs without credit. It's an impossible situation that they're in. They're really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what I always say, even to to people like my parents and people who don't like the Castro regime and don't like communism, exactly what you said at the beginning, Hanieh. It's like, if you want change in Cuba, the best thing that you can do, I don't care if you want it to remain a socialist country, like let's say I do, or you want it to become, that there's a Starbucks on every corner of Havana. Neither of those things can happen until the blockade is lifted, because Cuba is stuck. They are literally frozen in time. That's the thing people say about Cuba as one of its charms. But it is frozen in time because of US sanctions. They have those classic American cars from the 50s that they fix up with like German parts and Russian parts because they can't import new cars from the United States, right? Like, it's very difficult to do. And then we get into the problem of how much money people actually have in their pocket, which is not very much. So all of these things compound into a situation that is untenable. It's been untenable for years, and there was some hope, or with the Obama thaw, that things would be different. And they prepared for this. They pumped millions of dollars into refurbishing their sort of tourist area. They built a whole new market to welcome American tourists. That's what they were counting on. And Trump pulled the rug out from under them by reversing everything Obama had done and re-adding Cuba to this state sponsors of terrorism list. So between that and the COVID pandemic, they have had an extremely difficult 5 years in Cuba. And there are signs. Some days you read signs that things might be getting better, and other days you read signs that things are getting worse. And it's like I say, they're at an untenable point, and something's going to have to give one way or the other. Of course, the goal of the sanctions is to foment a right-wing reactionary movement that takes over Cuba. That's what they want. So far, I think it says a lot about Cubans' trust in their government that has not happened. And I don't really see that happening as an outcome, because there is a deep social fabric that has been woven with revolutionary, ideas and the way that we conduct our society in Cuba. But yeah, it's just terrible. And I was saying a little bit earlier that it's often difficult to relay what's going on in Cuba in an impactful way in light of like the genocide in Gaza, or in light of other just terrible sanctions regime. But to me, we are purposely starving an entire nation of people. That is what we are doing. The gravity of that, to me, there aren't bombs falling. There isn't a military, but a lot of the same critiques that we levy at Israel for how they dealt with Gaza even before this war are actively true in Cuba, and not just funded by the United States, directly being done by the United States.
That's right.
And so I'm hoping that we can raise the cause of Cuba to the same level of concern that we do for all the other countries that unfortunately are under our boot.